Welcome to the Building Efficiency Resources podcast, the BERcast. I'm Chris McTaggart, along with my sidekick in style, Sandy Gallo. We are here to discuss today Sandy's trip to the National Home Performance Conference next week in Minneapolis, along with the so contentious debates over what is going on with the 2024 IECC and its development with our colleagues Gayathri, Vijayakumar, and Rich Truitt, a code official from Maryland. Hey, Sandy, how's it going? How you doing, brother?
Good, Chris, man. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. So I hear you're making a trip next week. Where are you off to?
I'm off to the National Home Performance Conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
You know, is this kind of like the successor to what was ACI?
Yes, so Building Performance Association is the one that's putting on the National Home Performance Conference, and yes, that's correct. It was actually a union of a few of these organizations that existed throughout the U.S., and they combined into the Building Performance Association. So
yeah, with our good buddy Xavier Walter. So
it's
cool to be able to go and hang out with Xavier and get to know what's going on in the world of existing homes. That should be interesting. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of anxiety about what happens with the IRA. Is it safe? Is it not safe? I got to tell you, there was some discussion at the resident board meeting this week about that. You know, there was some talk about if there are some political wind shifting, could some of these tax credits potentially be at risk? You know, and here's the thing. I think that this is a political talking point. Personally, I think it's something that it's easy to come off like, you know, the fiscal stewards and we're going to get rid of all this green stuff. But, you know, when it really comes down to it, you know, a lot of the states that stand to benefit the most from the IRA are red states, namely Texas. You know, Texas is, you know, along with California, one of the highest producers of renewable energy. Obviously, for our sector, you know, the 45L, Texas builds more homes than anybody else, and so you know the builder lobbyists, they're all gearing up for the 45L. They're all trying to, you know, value engineer their packages here so they can meet Energy Star version 3.2. So I don't know. I'm not quite so sold that the IRA is going to get gutted. What do you think, Sandy?
So here, I'll give you some perspective, real world perspective, you know, as someone that, you know, has been around for a long time. So when another president was elected, I happened to be at the Energy Star partner meeting. Okay. And, you know, aside of, you know, people crying and, you know, everything else that was going on, everybody was like, we have no idea what's going to happen. They're going to eliminate the EPA and they're going to do this, they're going to do that. And pretty much nothing happened. So that's my first perspective, is that these things, you know, I think a lot of it is political hyperbole, you know, and I think it's purposely done to strike fear into people. The second thing is, let me tell you something, you know, no matter what your stand on the 45L tax credits were in the past or present, this is a major piece of legislation that's been carried through by both parties. And I don't see it, especially with the strength of the home building lobby, that this is ever going to go away. So I would say that I lived through this fake terror before, and you know, it was basically, you know, sum zero, net change zero. And you know, I mean, other than on the regulatory side of the EPA, they saw no effect at all. You know, so I'm not really that scared. I think that, you know, I think everybody realizes now that it's the right thing to do. I mean, could you see some altercation? I don't think you're going to see it in 45L tax credits. I can tell you that.
Right.
But you may see some of the more aggressive, you know, electrification stuff get throttled a little bit. But I think everybody's smart enough to realize that that's not the right way to go. So I would say
Are they smart enough? I don't know. You're giving them a lot of credit, but here's what I will tell you. I think you're dead nuts right on when it comes to 45L. I don't see that going away. Again, for those who are newer to the industry, The 45L came around in 2005 through an EPA Act, basically an Energy Policy Act. Who was the president at that time? Yeah, it wasn't Obama, so people forget about that stuff. So
Yep.
this came about as part of US energy policy. Energy efficiency was something on the table that was a little bit more that both parties could get behind. Let's just say that much. So I think especially when it impacts big business, national home builders, large energy producers that are already starting to factor in some of the implications of some of the tax benefits.
Yep.
The automakers, now obviously some of them have pumped the brakes a little bit on EVs and how fast they're going to do it, but I still think that they're counting on that being a tool in their toolkit for somewhere down the line. So, so I would assume when you go there to the conference next week, I mean, the thing that's going to be on people's minds is the Homes Act,
Yep.
the high efficiency electric rebate program, HERA, the 25C,
25C. Yep.
because those are the ones that I think really are promoting building electrification a little bit more and building energy efficiency. Now, I mean, to me, this would just not make any sense whatsoever to gut these provisions, because these ones are the ones that actually directly benefit the consumer the most. Because the Homes Act, when it comes out, we're going to have, this is the existing homes federal tax credit that we've been waiting for 20 years. And so this is finally here. And so I don't know. I mean, I get that people like to bluster about fiscal conservancy and, hey, the other side put this in and it's an agenda or whatever. But the reality is that everybody's utility bills have gone up. Everybody's. If you're in West Virginia, like I was this summer, people were talking about their energy bills going up, and that is not a demonstrably red state. It's not a demonstrably blue state. It's somewhere in between. And so, but it's a poor state and it matters, and so they may like to, I know that a lot of people feel some kind of way about the evolution of how we produce energy and certain, raw materials that may go into the production of energy there. But nevertheless, the people were feeling it. It was being discussed. It was in the papers. The cost of energy going up was in the papers. And it's just not a uniquely one way or the other kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like I'm feeling it here in Michigan. Our utilities have continuously raised rates here. Our main utility here in Detroit, bless their hearts, but they have gone to the Public Service Commission to request a rate increase twice this year. Twice, and that's mainly on the electrical side, but everybody pays electricity. And especially if you're trying to move to things like heat pumps and things like that, then you're really paying for it. So I don't know. What about there in Florida? I mean, has it been more
Well,
stable or?
no, I mean, I would say that I've seen real world about a 25% increase in my electricity bill. Now, I live in an all electric home too, right? So I'm a good example. Right.
Yep.
So I everybody's feeling the pinch. And I think that one way for people, especially in the retrofit market and for older homes and homes that are, geared up for these things, if they do it right, I always have to say that. I think it can make a big difference. And I don't see, I'll be honest with you, there's all this talk about inflation and I don't see that going away anytime soon. And it would be political suicide for anybody to come in and not and end programs that are going to help, especially disadvantaged, and low income housing or just housing in general, because everybody from the top tax tier down to the bottom is feeling the pinch, and it's not going to get any better. I mean, Powell just said it the other day in his announcement itself. Inflation, he basically admitted that inflation is uncontrollable. So, again, I feel pretty positive that none of this cart is going to get tossed, and if it is, it's going to be minor at best.
And look, I know that we're going to have some people, because like the BERcast has diverse listenership. Not everybody who listens to the BERcast thinks that the tax and spend way of doing things is necessarily going to get us to the promised land. And you know what? I understand that perspective. I think that there's
Absolutely.
value to that. But here's what I'll say is everybody has rallied around the idea that we need more affordable housing. And no offense to my builders out there, which we need more supply, clearly. And so we need to help builders be able to build homes. But the most affordable housing that we have is the stuff that we already have.
Yep.
And if we can then make that housing more affordable because the bills go down, that's better for everybody. It doesn't matter whether or not you're concerned about carbon or not. And I need y'all to keep that in mind. Y'all, I know who you are. I know who you are. Some of you who are listening are like, I'd actually be okay if the IRA went away because that was a big tax and spend agenda and I don't agree with it. And again, I've never necessarily been the person who thinks that, more and more federal spending is necessarily going to get us to the promised land either. But notwithstanding, especially when we're talking about these credits that are targeted more to the consumer, they will make housing more affordable if done correctly. And again, we talked a lot about how to make sure it's done correctly, and
Yeah.
I'm sure the conference will be focused on how to get it done correctly. But I just
I
don't
think
want
there has
people
to
to forget
be,
that.
Chris, I think there has to be some perspective, right? This isn't the federal government spending $2 million on watching a salamander crawl on a wheel for some physics reason. That you hear all these crazy stories, right? That's not what this is. I mean, I just read this week, yesterday, as a matter of fact, a multifamily executive. There was an excellent article on existing multifamily houses and how electrification, improving electrification measures, everything from shower heads, anything conservative, it not only boosts profitability but maintains the level and pricing of affordable housing. And it was an excellent article. And this stuff, look, there's pretend world and then there's the real world. Let's just be honest. Without government help, without programs that will help these people, it's never going to happen. It's never going to get done, and there's never going to be affordability. And look, I'm not a big government guy. You know that. We're friends personally. I'm not a giant government guy, but in this case, I believe in this stuff because there's no way that the market itself, especially with the outrageous inflation and the more costs, are going through and on, and how everything is just everybody's getting squeezed. There's no way that they can do it on their own, and everybody benefits from this. Everything from affordability to profitability for the people that own the buildings to the earth, which is the most important part. I mean, so it's everybody wins in this scenario. Now, are we going to have to pay a little bit more taxes? Probably, but I'd rather see my money spent, in a logical way, to increase the housing stock, preserve and conserve what we have as far as resources, make things more affordable than hamsters running on a treadmill. So that's my perspective on the whole thing, Chris.
Well, yeah, and I will just go ahead and second you on this because, fun fact, my parents back in the 1970s invested in a couple old apartment buildings, small apartment buildings in Midtown Detroit, which Detroit, I'm sure everybody's heard the gory, brutal details about Detroit, and there's a lot of horror stories, and all I can tell you is that,
And Detroit pizza, don't forget about that. I mean,
hey man, the pizza, you got to come for the pizza. You got to come for the pizza, come for the Riverwalk. Detroit's making a lot of
I didn't
progress.
mean that as a positive, but anyway.
Oh yeah, well you wish, man. Whatever, I mean, you're from Long Island, so you got good pizza. So cannot posture on the pizza. I think New York still has us beat. That's me as a Detroiter saying it. So I'm being from the heart.
I'm glad you admitted that. Thank you.
It's about one of the only things that y'all.
Yeah, there we go.
All right. But being serious here, Detroit's come a long way, and Midtown Detroit is come a long way. It's come near a major public university, Wayne State University, and so I've started to manage these buildings on behalf of my parents. So these are from like the turn of the 20th century, like 1890 and like 1900. These are old buildings, they're leaky, no insulation, etc. And I will say, getting to be in the role of a landlord, especially with old buildings that need a lot of other stuff, right? They just need upkeep in general. Even though I'm a green guy and I want to do all this energy stuff, it's tough to prioritize it by itself sometimes. And so with some of these programs coming out, absolutely I'm looking at it. Absolutely I'm looking at this as an opportunity to insulate that attic, air seal that attic, spray foam the rim joists, and maybe even switch over to heat pumps, maybe, so that people have more direct control over their heating and cooling. And and I'll say, from a business standpoint too, yeah, I'm doing something maybe that's good for the earth, but from an ROI standpoint, yeah, if I reduce the energy bills for the building, I'm putting money back in my pocket over time.
Right.
And if I switch to heat pumps, then all of a sudden I don't pay the whole building's energy bill. The tenants do, which increases my ROI even more so. And so I will just say, this is a business centered tax credit. So, people want to go, oh, yeah, well, of course, the big builders, they're going to get theirs. And of course, the big energy companies, they're going to get theirs. I want to empower people going into this national conference to just realize, represent, stay firm. This is a business thing. We are a business. This is an industry. But the people who we serve stand to benefit. The homeowners, low income folks that need affordable housing, as well as businesses, especially property owners. Multifamily
Right.
property owners stand to benefit from this in a very significant way. So again, those who are not quite sold on the agenda or the method, um, I understand, but I will just say, try to understand the bigger opportunity here, because again, for renters, your landlord isn't going to go and insulate your attic.
Yeah.
They're not. Why would they? But this might get them there, because now there is more reason for them to do so. Um,
And the
and
reason is that ROI, right? Like in that multifamily executive article I was telling you about, that's what they talk about. 17% on average per building. That's a lot of money on a large multifamily complex. So I mean, I think that you're right that it's not only, I mean, yes, the most important part is conserving and guarding the earth and making sure that we're not doing all these things that are going to affect our children and grandchildren. But the real day right now picture, the ROI is tremendous for anybody that's smart enough to take advantage of it.
no doubt. Well, I'm happy that you're heading there, Sandy, and you're going to represent BER well, and just stay positive, people. We're heading in the right direction as an industry, and don't forget it. So we're going to go ahead and roll into segment number 2 right now, where we're going to be talking about what has been happening with the 2024 IECC. Lots of contentious things going on with the 2024 IECC. And you may notice that for the last one, I had a mustache before, and I don't now, because we recorded part 1 prior to recording, or recorded part 2 before we recorded part 1, but that's okay. We're going to go ahead and roll into segment 2 right now. Okay, so rolling here into segment 2, which is our guest segment here on the BERcast. We have a pretty exciting, kind of controversial topic here to discuss, which is the status of the 2024 International Energy Conservation Code. And joining us are 2 guests, esteemed colleagues from the industry. We have Gayathri Vijayakumar. She is someone who I would consider to be one of the masters of the industry. She is the head of the SBC 300 Standards Development Committee for ResNet, which, if you don't know what that is, basically the nerds nerd cult, basically the people who actually go through and figure out all of the physics math associated with how HERS ratings should be calculated. But not only just that, but also how to sort of administer the standard development process. Gayathri has been basically the leader of that for what now? About 6 years, 5, 6 years, something like that.
Yeah, I think for ResNet, I came on around 2018. Yeah, so 6 years.
Okay. And but beyond that, obviously we have Gayathri on the call here because she was part of the Standard Development Committee for the 2024 IECC, which may surprise some people to hear this, but the IECC, the International Energy Conservation Code, was actually developed via a standards development process for this cycle. The ICC made the decision to move the code to a standard development process, although my understanding is it is still a code. So we're going to talk about some of those nuances here because that's a little bit weird. Rich Truitt is a colleague of mine, a code official from so Hartford County, Maryland, and so decent amount of development, kind of on the fringe of rural, but also kind of the larger Baltimore, DC, complex. Lots of new development coming in your region, right, Rich?
Yep. Yeah, we're smack dab between Baltimore and Philly, so on the I-95 corridor. So yeah, we're more of a bedroom community, multiplying into our own kind of little area in the country. So with Aberdeen Proving Ground right next to us, we've got a lot of military resource in the jurisdiction. So yeah, it's got a population of about 260,000, cover about 440 square miles in the jurisdiction. So
Okay, wow. So Rich and I, we've actually given some presentations on the role of third-party professionals within the energy code verification process, and we're going to be going back at it here coming up in, what is that, in May, I guess.
May.
We're going to
Yep.
be going to Sacramento at the National Energy Codes Conference in order to teach that. But man, I think that this is going to be an interesting conference then coming up because if you have not heard about some recent news that has happened within the last week or so, the 2024 IECC, again, developed via a standards development process, which means that the individuals who were involved in that process were sort of elected in order to represent that standard development. So they were chosen based off of their professional reputation and expertise across the board. People from not only the energy consulting and energy rating industry, but then people from the code official industry like Rich, and then builders and contractors, manufacturers, policymakers. So it wasn't just a one-dimensional. It wasn't just a bunch of energy geeks getting in a room and coming up with their best interpretation of what the code might be. Obviously, standard development, not everybody's going to necessarily, if anybody's participating in developing standards, not everybody necessarily sees the world the same way, but nevertheless, coming out of it through the consensus process, there was a draft 2024 IECC, and yet again, some people were not so happy about the outcome of that process and made an appeal, from my understanding, to the ICC appeals board, and the appeals board basically decided that there wasn't enough substance to those appeals and chose to basically, say thank you, but no thank you to those appeals. But those appellants basically went straight to the ICC governing board of directors. And my understanding is that the board of directors themselves voted in order to basically uphold some of the appeals from the appellants. So is that accurate? And we'll get into the details of what the consequence of that is. But is that an accurate statement about what has transpired?
I think for the most part, yes. There was appeals that were made. The ICC board, under their development process under the CP, establishes the board or an appeals appellate function, and I have not seen their recommendations, but their recommendations are forwarded to the board, or their findings are forwarded to the board, and then the board ultimately makes the final decision. I think you got it pretty much about 90% right. And I just don't have enough information to know exactly what the 3-member appellate board what their rulings were, what their findings were, and their recommendation back to the board. But that was chaired by one of the executive members of the board, um, and then brought forth in a board meeting.
And you did have that right, Chris. That appeals board did roughly, maybe you paraphrase it, but they decided their recommendation to the board. If you haven't seen the ruling, it is posted on the website. They recommended that the board of directors does not uphold the appeals. So it is true that was part of the council policy. It wasn't, the appellants. The next stage of the process in the council policy is accurate. They go from the appeals board, and then the next step is always the board of directors. But the appeals board, that 4-panel board, that was the recommendation, that they didn't find any procedural violations from the appellant.
Okay, so anyway, that all sounds pretty boring, right? A lot of procedural stuff with appeals committees and the board of directors. I couldn't imagine anything that was more tedious than that. But the reality is that this had some actual real world consequences, and the consequences were that some of the content, the new content that was as a part of the 2024 IECC, as determined by the Standards Development Committee for the 2024 IECC, was basically thrown out as a result of this board vote. And most notably, a lot of the provisions that relate to electrification readiness within residential buildings as well as in commercial buildings, my understanding. Gayathri, is that accurate?
I only sat on the residential, but so I can say it's accurate for residential, but commercial I'm less familiar.
Okay. That's okay. So you only were involved in the residential process.
So Rich and I sat on the residential consensus committee.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. We'll have to look into commercial and the implications there. But my understanding is that there were similar, items, particularly those that might impact like larger multifamily buildings that again relate to electric readiness that basically were tossed out as part of this. So I want to take a step back here, because that's why I wanted to have these folks on here. The truth is, I've been wanting to discuss with them about just where we stand with the 2024 ICC, because it is, in fact, 2024. And we're a little bit later in the cycle, I think, than we typically would be. And I think that, the energy code is lagging behind perhaps some of the other building codes in terms of their development cycle at this point. Um, so I think everybody's excited to know what's going on with the 2024. I think that there's people from different sort of, I guess, persuasions, people who are really into energy efficiency. They always want to know what's in the new code. And the 2021 IECC was, I think, a glimmer of hope in an accomplishment, I would say, for the efficiency community, because really between 2012 and 2018, there wasn't really a whole lot of improvement in the residential energy code. Really small steps, 1-2%, et cetera. Some improvements, I would say, in terms of sort of cleaning up the language, perhaps, but not a whole much in terms of, a big step forward in building energy efficiency and savings. 2021 really brought a lot. And it and really changed the code in a lot of ways. And so people who are advocates for energy efficiency were, thrilled with it. Those who are concerned about perhaps, stability within the code and predictability and, perhaps, cost efficiency in the development community were less excited about that. And so with 2024 now moving to a standards development process, I think that there was a perception out there that maybe this was going to be a a more builder friendly code or something like that, and I think as it's turned out, it turned out to be, I think, a pretty mixed representation, and I think there were sort of wins on all sides. I would say certain things that builders like performance equipment trade-offs, those were factored in a way that they hadn't been factored in since the 2006 IECC. Whereas some things that really people within the efficiency and sustainability community think are absolutely critical, like electrification readiness, were kind of brought forth for the first time. So I've been wanting to talk about the 2024, maybe Gayathri, because you've been involved now here for a little while in code development. Maybe tell me what stood out to you about the difference in this process compared to, say, the 2021 IECC process.
Sure. So for folks that participate in code hearings, the IRC, the IMC, the IBC still follow this kind of code hearing development process. It was really just the IECC that switched over to being developed more like a standard. Still code, but developed like a standard. So I've experienced the 2021 development in the code hearing world and 2018. So back in 2021, you have a small committee, so anyone can submit a proposal. And so there's a residential committee. I don't know how they're selected, maybe Rich does, but there's a small residential committee, maybe like 11, 12 people. And your first shot of like hearing your proposal, I care about air leakage. So my first thing was like, I want to change air leakage. And so you have to convince them, but there's also people lined up to speak for and against your proposal. It's public knowledge what your proposal says. They speak for and against, but it's that small little committee that has to make a choice. And then they decide, go forward, don't go forward. And then there's a public comment hearing. So same thing, this public comment hearing is where Rich and other like government officials, they have the voting, right? So you're making a case for your proposal. You've changed it maybe based on what residential committee members said. You've changed it based on what public comment, right? So your proposal goes out and the public can comment on it and just say, oh, this is terrible. This is great. So you have to pivot and make modifications. I did stuff on like the ERI, right? Energy Rating Index. For a long time, my thing has been to get the ERI into multifamily. So that's something I did in the 2021 cycle. And some people didn't like that I was putting the ERI in the commercial code for the very first time. They're like, hey, Gayathri, this doesn't address central systems. Like, can we just do it on in-unit systems? So I compromised and I said, okay, sure. I'll show you that it works for everything, but I can compromise and modify my proposal to get it in there. And so I let it just be available for apartments and high rises that just had in-unit systems. So you get to have a little bit of that dialogue, but not a lot. So I liked that they switched to this consensus development process because that's what I've been doing with the ANSI standards. And you have, I think, better opportunity at dialogue, figuring out what people's pain points are, and actually having a discussion that leads up to the proposal. So in terms of the makeup, there's 48 voting members. And I think somewhere there's a policy that said when we establish this group of consensus members, we are going to give the biggest block to the code officials. I think they were intentional, right? They didn't want to remove power from the code officials. The code officials were that government, voting block. So they, most consensus standards committees had to be balanced and diverse. And so you can't have one group have more than 50% share, right? So they gave the code officials 1/3. So they are 16 people. And then everybody else, like you said, Chris, builders and designers, policymakers, we make up the other share. So for us to get any proposals forward requires 2/3 of us. So 32 of us have to agree to any kind of code change. So there was a lot of back and forth. There were subcommittees, but again, it's still because we had so many subcommittees, there was a lot of interaction. So I think in theory, it was supposed to work really well, but I'll pause and let Rich chime in there.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. This was definitely a different way of adopting the energy code and looking at it. When the board decided to go this route, I think they were looking at what gave the best opportunity to put a good product forth. I looked at some of the proposals that got done in 18 or in 21 code, and some of the in-person voting was greatly outweighed by the online governmental consensus votes that came in. So changes occurred just because of that governmental consensus vote. So this did definitely provide almost 2 years, Gayathri, of us sitting down, meeting almost on a weekly basis, and sometimes multiple times in a week to discuss, not only in subcommittee but in actual consensus committee process, um, debate the merits of these code changes. It allowed us on the fly to make changes where the previous process did not. We were able to identify things that we could bring forward to help a code change proposal along, and make those changes that we felt were better, to enhance the code, where the previous governmental consensus process would not do that. The one thing that I found was it was heavy lift for government code officials, like me. I'm still trying to run a department, and the amount of hours that we spent, in this, I found it challenging to be able to participate at the level every week that I needed to participate. You had a lot of very heavy technical discussions that we had, and debated a lot of very technical merits of different code provisions, especially the new 408 table, and the values of on that table came out. And I was grateful to see that 408 table come out. We were successful in kind of lifting some of the provisions out of 408 and 24 for the Maryland adoption, and actually made a Maryland amendment that is very close to what we're going to see in 24, and got the state to approve that. And that's what we're moving forward with here. And when I adopt the 21 code in 2 months. So, there was a lot of good. I learned a lot of things about energy code that I would have never known had we gone through the governmental consensus process, because it forced me to sit and participate in this process. I was using Bluebeam and making notes on PDFs, and and color coding everything as much as I could. And so when we got to the committee votes and we were tallying our votes, I was able to at least kind of keep track of those things. So it's definitely a much different process than I was used to as part of the governmental consensus process that, I've always participated in for all the other I codes, that we've had. So, I think it's probably the right way to keep going. As Gayathri said, the mix of individuals. Yes, we had government code officials, but those government code officials were made up of energy managers and code officials like me, and we have differing views. I've got to be the boots on the ground to enforce the energy code, and I've got to be able to discuss with Johnny Q homeowner that comes in and wants to build their own house, who doesn't have the expertise in the energy code, and be able to walk them through, getting a project to comply. And most of the time, that's going to be the prescriptive R value process. But then, we've got dealing with raters and providers and these technical expertise that are providing us evaluations through performance and ERI scoring that we also have to address. So, it does become a heavy lift on the code official end to make all this work. And, we're trying to leverage technology. I've got my computer programming staff frantically working on changes to upgrade our technology. We are going to track compliance paths for every new home that is brought into the county once we go to 21. I'll be able to give you statistics, and I'll know which values, which 408 did they use, the 408 table in the 21 code, or did they use the Maryland amendment, and which additional info or additional item did they select. So this is all new to us. We're learning. And that process, is going to continue to evolve. And hopefully, we can start putting some things into, as Chris, you and I have talked, we've got to partner with the third parties. We got to start to heavily rely on third party individuals such as yourself to give us this information. And we have to, learn that pathway, and be able to communicate together out in the field. We're still seeing simple things as, performance-based reports being brought into us where they're amending the permit, and we can't get the volume of the house to match between report A and report B. And that should be something that should be a constant, and obviously has a dramatic effect on the air tightness scoring. equation. So, these are all different things, and we start to bring these things up to the different raters, and then they kind of start looking at us like we've got three heads, So it's been different.
Yeah, well, maybe if this continues on with the standard development process, and Rich, if you continue on with it, and maybe through some of the work that we're going to be trying to do together at the ResNet level, in terms of consistency of documentation, then maybe chapter one becomes a little bit more interesting. Maybe
Yeah.
chapter one really tells people what they're supposed to be documenting specifically and what that documentation looks like. Because, some of the things that you and I have talked about, is a code official, there's a goal to move to third-party verification because it can help to streamline the process. But, if you don't have that consistency in the documentation, then it really doesn't help you out a whole lot. So, Sandy, obviously you have the ear to the ground, of the both the builder community as well as kind of the production oriented rating community. What did you hear about the 2021 cycle and this move to more of a standard based development process for the 2024?
From an industry standpoint, everybody's been kind of like wait and see. You know what I mean? I wouldn't say that anyone's really, I've had a few articles shared with me, like, I don't know if you saw the Huffington Post, slamming the whole process and things like that. So I have had some constituents that I know in the industry, reach out, with some information like that. I would say that overall, though, it's more of a wait and see. I think that more than anything, I think it was the fact that a lot of this stuff got taken out of the code that would shock a lot of people, and that it's been that's been the buzz as of recent. But before that, I don't think anybody really weighed in on the change of the process or is it standard. It sounds like Richard, you think it's actually going to be a better process in the end, and I think that most people feel that way. But I do think there is a certain consensus out there of, what the heck, and why, and most of us that are, especially on this side of the industry, we're really clamoring and excited about, those changes in the code. And it almost feels like most people feel like we took like 2 steps forward to take 2 steps back.
And
I would say
Chris,
that's my main feedback.
Chris, if I can chime in, I think part of the elephant in the room here, and Gayathri and I spoke a little bit this morning. That all really boils down to the intent statement that the board created for the 21 or the 24 version of the code. I took a view of that intent statement kind of in line with what the board's action was, that those types of provisions were to be discussed by the committee, and I thought was very clear pathway that those provisions would be put into an appendice. So the provisions that we worked with, the outcome that we all achieved didn't necessarily get thrown out. It just came out of the body of the code. It's placed into an appendice. Now how jurisdictions adopt those appendices across this nation are different. Some jurisdictions are prohibited by state laws to adopt appendices, and some others are not. So I really think that it boiled down to what the intent was and the clear direction that we asked for from a committee very early on in this was, provide us the direction, because we didn't have a good consensus at that point. And staff provided us with information back. And I think the committee members provided their votes based upon that information. I kind of was still looking at and making that question in my mind based upon the intent and based upon the information that was provided. What was the link between those two? And I had to make decisions I felt were best moving forward, not only for my jurisdiction, but as a committee member, what was best for the code, what was best for ICC, and in the development process. and that's how I looked at my votes. So I don't know, Gayathri, I think we do kind of agree on some things, but you probably have a little bit different shade too as well.
Yeah, I think the phrase that's going around is like, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. When the 2021 IECC was completed, right, appeals were filed based on this argument that the Energy Conservation Code could only contain certain measures. So even if everyone voted for it and it passed, an appeals process is not technical. It's based on procedure. So people that didn't like EV charging and electric readiness being in the 2021 ICC submitted appeals based on process violations, meaning this wasn't in the scope or intent. Why did you let the committees or the voters vote on it? And so that appeals decision removed electric vehicle charging from the commercial code and electric readiness for gas stoves in the 2021 cycle. And so when I joined, I don't have a lot in scope and intent, but here's the intent statement on the screen, not subject to public input. So I think why a lot of people are really upset is not because of the outcome of the code. Honestly, the 2024 will still be 6%, 7% better than 2021. What bothers us is that we're repeating the same mistake as the last time under the old process, right? The old process was this code hearing cycle where the board got to say at the end of the process, oh, that's not in our intent. Yes, we should remove that, rather than saying from up front that don't submit this proposal. Like, why let anyone debate or vote on a proposal if the board knows it's not part of the scope or intent of the book, right? There's supposed to be a screening process. So early, like Rich said, early in the process, we got about 200 proposals at the end of 2021. So as we start having these conversations about what can be in the body of the code, we look at this intent statement. And everything I personally had read on the internet about leading the way to efficiency and, this new path forward to confronting climate change, I read this intent statement and it doesn't say that you can't put those kind of provisions in the main body. It says you may, like you can highlight that sentence in the middle, the code may include appendices incorporating blah, blah, blah. So I think everyone who writes codes or is involved in codes knows the word may is not supposed to be used in code language. So I think there's a little bit of anger, resentment, the fact that the board of directors owns this intent statement. They write it. Their board of directors wrote this, approved it maybe 2 or 3 years ago. This was not subject to the consensus committee's input, not subject to the public input. And early on, when it was like, oh, you know what, Rich reads it one way, I read it another way, it was split in the consensus committee. Like, where do these provisions go? How do we vote on these if we don't even know where to put it? Right? That changes your vote. If you're like, oh, this is ultimately 2 years later is going to get yanked out, I'm not going to vote for it in the main body. I'm going to do something else. Right? And so we asked as a consensus committee, can the board of directors who wrote this, can they tell us clearly, definitively, where do electric vehicle charging requirements go? Where does electric readiness go? Where does PV readiness go? We asked them point blank. We got a memo back in February of 2022 from ICC staff that said the board does not weigh in during a development process. But the point is they should have. They should have been willing to interpret the sentence that they wrote and just give us clear guidance. That's all we wanted was clear guidance. We asked for clear guidance. We didn't get clear guidance. That would have changed the whole process, right? If they gave that determination back then, like this is what it means. You shall only be in an appendix. They could have written it that way and enforced it that way, or just like interpreted it that way. Then we would all have made different decisions, right? We would all been playing under the same rules, but instead we got that memo back that said it's actually up to the consensus committee to decide. So the consensus committee sees this memo from staff, ICC staff, telling us it's up to you guys. You guys vote. If you have consensus to put it in main body, that's what it is. If you have consensus that it belongs in appendix, that's what you do. So we build consensus around thinking this is up to us. So I think a lot of people, it's not so much the outcome, it's that the rules changed at the end. It's like playing a new sport and they're like, you ask like how things are going to get scored. And they're like, well, we'll tell you at the end how it's scored. Right. And then the referee is like, well, this is how you're going to get scored. And you're like, okay, that's the best we can go off of. Let's go off of that. And then at the very end, they're like, oh, this is actually what it is. So I think that's what the frustration is.
Yeah, Sandy, Sandy, if you can maybe scroll down to section 404, I think that's really where the heart of a lot of these more controversial provisions lived and or currently live in the draft version, but it sounds like they're not going to be there again. Haven't been a participant in helping to write standards. It is a time-consuming process. You are being brought into something that is oftentimes it extends a lot of time, and especially us as working professionals. I think that anything that sort of extends the time that we're debating things that then ends up sort of resulting in a moot point, that's very frustrating. I would feel like my time was wasted if I were someone who was in there, because ultimately, like you're saying, Gayathri, I mean, different people are going to feel different ways about the merits, the goals, and whether it's good or bad. And again, here on the BERcast, we're not really here to say whether it's good or bad or not. But I think what you're frustrated about, and many people are frustrated about who participated in this process or monitored this process, is the decision was up to the consensus committee. It really was not intended to be something that could be sort of debated after the end of the process. And had it been more clear from the beginning that these particular provisions were simply, going to be included as appendices or considered as appendices, well, that would have changed it fundamentally. It would have shortened the process substantially, really, because I don't know that everybody understands the nuance there. An appendix of the code is there. It's not actually part of the code. If a state or jurisdiction adopts the code, they could also choose to include the appendix, but they don't have to. And so, so to me, I think it does make a big difference, because, if it is natively in the code and it is part of a mandatory set of requirements, and let's just take solar readiness, because solar readiness was an appendix in 2021, right? And maybe even in 2018, I can't remember, but it's been around for a minute, I believe. So, to say, well, it'd been a lot easier to just say that's where it's going to live, and anything that deals with, how we're going to wire houses essentially for future readiness of electrification or solar readiness. Like, if we would all just said, well, it has to live within that domain, that's just the intent and the scope, then the people who participated in this process would have been able to go through it with that lens, and I think it would have probably saved a lot of time. I don't know, Rich, what do you think?
Absolutely. And Gayathri probably remembers, I was probably one of the first people to speak up when we were actually trying to develop the subcommittees, and what topics, where we were going to place the buckets per se. And I actually spoke up because one of them was, I forget the name of the subcommittee, but it was ready or electrification or decarbonization, things like that. And I brought up the issue right then and there. I was like, hey, does this meet the intent of the code? And if it doesn't meet the intent of the code, why are we creating a subcommittee to talk about these things? And staff's response back at that point, and probably appropriate, was, hey, we're not saying whether it meets the intent of the code or not at this point. This is where we're going to categorize. This is what subcommittee is going to hear, and then we're going to debate the merits of that. We spent many, many hours in many different meetings debating whether or not it met the intent of the code, and they were a little bit contentious at times. When we did that. Now, to your point of whether it's in the main body of the code or an appendice, I look at the code, and this is probably, my 30 years of experience dealing with codes so far. The IRC and the predecessor being the KBO 1 and 2 family dwelling code being a minimum prescriptive based design. So when I'm looking at the residential energy code provisions, I kind of geared to, let's create a minimum prescriptive based design that, everybody can use. And then we move forward with other things such as, ERI score or performance based provisions. And when we talk about adoptions, just because it's in the main body of the book that is produced by ICC, and I think that's very critical. ICC just produces a book. That's all they do. It doesn't become code until a governmental jurisdiction adopts it, and where it becomes law. And this goes back to, you know, the copyright issues and everything else that are going on in our country. But, you know, as a local jurisdiction, I have prohibitions based upon state of Maryland that says I can't weaken the code. I can strengthen the energy code, but I can't weaken it. Not everybody has that same provision. So a electrification provision or an EV ready provision that came out of this committee that's in the code could be simply removed by a jurisdiction that adopts it, or adopts it as appendice, you know, depending upon how they see fit, which is best for their jurisdiction. And that's kind of how I've always perceived code development. Let's give the best standard that we can, based upon the intent, based upon what the code is, and then jurisdictions are going to do what they see as best for their jurisdiction with that information. The way I saw the intent statement was that the ICC board recognized that they wanted to do a glide path to net zero. They wanted to do these other issues that are being brought up by my colleagues that were on the board and by other specialized interest groups. Recognize that there's a placeholder in the code, and I took it as they needed to be in an appendice. You know, let's deal with things that deal with energy efficiency in the building, and then complement those with appendices. So that's just how I took it. I think some of my colleagues on the committee took it that way. Obviously, there's a lot of my colleagues on the committee that saw it different ways, like Gayathri, and I respect their views as well. You know, this was the first shot that we had as a governmental consensus, not using the governmental consensus process, using a standard accredited process. And we learned a lot of valuable lessons through it. And how the board moves forward, I think for the 27 edition is going to be critical, and moving into the decisions that they're going to make. And hopefully they learn and provide the guidance that the committee asked for in moving forward. You know, this I think is a product that is good. You know, I've got some feelings about it in different ways. You know, as Kristen, you and I spoke, you know, there are going to be challenges for code officials to enforce some of this. We have to be educated and learn exactly, you know, what this means for our jurisdictions. And that's going to be the huge challenge, the huge lift as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think your point about, you know, that codes get, you know, what you all participated in was the development of a model code.
Right.
And codes get adopted at the local or jurisdictional level, sometimes at a whole statewide level. And the adopting jurisdiction has the ability to amend the code. And we see it all the time. And this is part of the reason why BER has set out to basically create state specific code training series that kind of tease out those specific amended elements of the code, because it's confusing, right? You know, states adopt versions of the various year model codes, but then they create amendments. Oftentimes, those are weakening amendments. They make the code, they scrap the things they don't really want to include for whatever reason, or change the numbers so that the code is perhaps a little bit less stringent. You know, and so I think that that's a good point. I mean, I suppose my only counter concern, though, is that kind of the purpose of a model code is to be aspirational, and it is to kind of set a path forward. And so if and you know, so I'm just looking at this, and you know, I think sometimes one of the challenges too is we look at the building codes as if the purpose of them is to create something that's being built today. And you know, and so how is the home going to perform on day one? But the reality is, buildings from an energy perspective are, you know, they're going to be around for a while, right? They're going to be around for decades. And so I can see why certain consensus members of, you know, of the standard development committee saw some of these electrification readiness provisions as a long-term conservation measure, you know, because, you know, I understand right now electrification is, you know, it's controversial in some ways, because the technology is there, but the cost of electricity is kind of high, and you know, and I think that there's still future improvements to come, basically, for high performance heat pumps and things like that are just an absolute total slam dunk. I think in certain areas of the country, Sandy and I have been covering this for a long time. So anybody who's a long time listener, you've heard us run our mouths about heat pumps and where they stand and what are the benefits and what are some of the challenges. But overall, BER is pro electrification long term. So it's sort of like challenges. If we don't put these things from the get go, they become a lot more difficult to potentially retrofit, after the fact. And so I don't know, Sandy. I mean, I don't know. What do you think? Are these conservation measures or are these sort of accessories?
No, I think they're conservation. I think and I'd like to get Gayathri, your perspective on this. But this kind of to me, when I look at it from the 10,000-foot view, really kind of flies in the face against governmental policymakers who are pushing all this stuff. I mean, all we hear about is this program and that program, the IRA, and how we're going to pay for heat pumps and all this stuff. And I think me personally, I'm just a little disappointed that, in this process, the next step wasn't taken. And I think that really, yes, and Rich, I see your perspective as well, but I would say that, if it's in the code as part of the code, it's much more, I think, likely to be adopted, than its present form. And I just think that, if we don't push this, everybody keeps talking about 2035 and 2050, the next code cycle is 2027, everyone. And I think from my perspective, I find it to be disappointing, and I think it flies in the face of everything that everyone from government regulators down to policymakers and everyone else is talking about on a regular basis. So I kind of get your perspective on that. How you feel about that? What do you think about, what I just said about that flying in the face of the,
Absolutely.
policymakers?
I mean, everything I had read. So it was an application. I'm not sure how Chris mentioned it before, but it was actually an application process if you wanted to be part of this residential consensus committee. And so I remember reading all the new documents, the energy framework, the decarbonization plan from the IECC. I read all their information. There's solar panels on their leading the way forward document, right? So I was actually inspired to say, you know what, this is it. Because I thought our mission was, we got 3 chances to get to net zero. We're going to convene a committee of diverse stakeholders, all perspectives, and you have 3 shots to get to net zero at 2030. And I generally thought that was the plan. So every meeting we're in, it's okay, people would say Gayathri, that sounds like a 2027 thing. That sounds like a 2030 thing. So I thought we were all kind of on this page where it's the task we've been given is to methodically move the code forward. And by 2030, it has to be net zero. So definitely at Stephen Winter, we know that means it's an all electric building. And so it did seem like a very reasonable thing to expect. We should have electric readiness in the main body of the code, right? Solar readiness. Sure. Can everything just be ready? This will be the ready. I tell myself, this is the readiness code. And then the next cycle, we can push a little further. So in my mind, we were moving towards this 2030 goal of a net zero code. And to Rich's point, if the intent statement was never meant to be that. It was actually meant to always just be appendices that get you there to net zero. And the main body is only conservation. All we're saying is that would have been nice to know 3 years ago. Right. That's all. That's all we're mad about is that if that was always the plan, just tell us that 3 years ago before we start. You're right. We would have saved so much time and made different decisions. And they have the IRC and the IMC and the IBC. So there's this disconnect, okay? So Rich mentioned the committees that we have. We actually had a committee since day one called Envelope and Embodied Carbon, right? So thank goodness we didn't get any proposals on embodied carbon because same thing, where does that go? Right. We actually have a committee the ICC staff created anticipating proposals on embodied carbon. Is that energy conservation? No. But so where does it go? Folks on the IRC, IBC also got kind of flack for submitting it there. And so resistance there, but maybe that's not in the, so where does it go? This is the I code, the I suite of codes. All we're asking is for clear direction. You tell us which book these measures go, if it's main body or appendices, and then we can follow those rules. Just make the rules and don't change them later. That's all we're asking. So if they can't commit to that for 2027, I'm not sure there'll be a 2027. that moves forward, right? I'm sure there'll be a 2027 that maintains status quo but makes no progress. But most states, then what's the point of printing that book, right? ICC is in the business of printing books. So what's the point of printing a book that's basically no better than the 2024?
There's
So they
no
definitely
point. There's no point of a code if it doesn't progress.
right.
I mean, there's no point.
There's definitely things they can do. There are clear takeaways. It's whether they will do them, right? It's clear that they could write a better scope and intent and make it very crystal clear, like a guidance document. Like, this is what we mean. We mean electrification goes here. We mean embodied carbon goes in the IRC. Just be clear. Set the rules very clearly. Make sure the consensus committee, when they are brought on, understand. Just be very forthright with us. And then establish a % savings. We at the beginning of our meetings, Rich, like it was like, how much savings are we supposed to, like, what is the
What's our
end
target?
game? We couldn't even, I don't think we even ended up agreeing what it was supposed to be, right? There's a
No.
lot of like back and forth. So they should just set a mandate. We expect the 2027 to achieve 10% better than 2024. Get there how you get there, but that at least forces these diverse opinions
Sure,
to come together. Like, well, we got to get to 10%. We have to, right? So then how are we going to get there? Because then you
It
force people
facilitates
to move
all the
forward.
parties to contribute too, So
Yeah.
I mean, because you have to,
Yeah.
So Sandy,
good
to your point, Sandy, as a former member of the board, I struggled with decisions that came before us, when I was there, and I think ICC's at a crossroads right now with the energy code. When I was on the board, we made the conscious decision to stop the development of the green code, the ICC green code, and move that to Azure and partner with Azure. So I think right now the ICC has an identity crisis with the energy code of where do they want it to go. Obviously they have strategic alliances. Probably with DOE. ICC plays a very critical role for code development in that jurisdictions and states rely upon their expertise and their processes and how they do things to develop what we inherently adopt. There's no way that I could spend the amount of time that that we took just for the energy code
Sure.
to adopt a comprehensive code specifically for my jurisdiction or even the state. So ICC plays that critical role. They understand that role, and they take that challenge on. This is the way I see it. This is starting to become they have to identify the identity of where they want this to go. Exactly what Gayathri's saying. Because my vote would have been different on some of these changes or these modifications had better clarification or had the intent been moved or changed in a way. So I'm going off of what I believe the board's intent with this code was, and if it is going to be different, then I would encourage the board to take a look at this. I've spoken to a few of the board members already, with different things that have come up and some of the challenges that I've seen here in my jurisdiction, and kind of relayed the same thing. We need to move forward in a path and give us the guardrails, give us the direction. And you've got a lot of expertise, you got a lot of colleagues that were on the committee that can produce what you want and tell us what that is.
Yeah, because Rich, I mean, I guess the thing that when I first read about this, the thing that stood out to me, and I guess what I'm a little bit nervous about is like, does this undermine the value of the IECC process, and their brand really when it comes to the IECC? And I'm not saying that because I'm salty. Oh, I'm mad. I don't like what the outcome was. I actually care less about that. I like the IECC. I like the IECC. I think there's value to it. But here it is. If there are policymakers that have their own legislatively required goals for moving things forward, for bringing us to zero energy buildings here within fairly short order, and if the ICC can't get out of its own way, then I guess for energy maybe they're just going to have to turn to a different program or process for getting that. Like maybe jurisdiction or municipality just has to say, you know what, screw it. All these buildings have to be DOE Zero Energy Ready Homes version 2. And that way we know that they're going to have good envelopes and they're going to have a stringent energy rating index that factors in all the other good energy stuff. And they're going to be, zero energy, they're going to be solar ready homes and electrification ready homes. I don't have a problem with that necessarily, but that would be a major culture shift. Just think about that, the implications of that. And so, I would also just say for those who are kind of maybe on the other side, be careful what you ask for, because that could very well happen. If take a state like New York, we covered on the pod, a few casts ago that the state of New York has ambitious electrification goals that are supposed to come out of the energy code. My guess is that the state of New York was hoping that this code would have been their model code. And look, I guess you could argue, to be fair, that they could adopt some of those appendices. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. And so they could take the 2024 plus some of the EV readiness and some of the electrification readiness, solar readiness provision appendices. They could adopt those as well. And so maybe that is the path forward still, but I would be a little bit nervous for the ICC to start to be viewed as a sort of a faithless actor in this process of sort of a progressive path forward for achieving these goals, because these goals are being set forth by state governments. So the code officials and the other government actors, they have no choice but to implement them and get there. And so if you can't trust on getting it from the IECC, where are you going to get it from? I guess you're going to have to go someplace else. And that may just allow even less flexibility or trade-offs. Like, the IECC, it has 3 paths to compliance, and I think that that's great. It gives people some natural trade-off options. If you don't want to build prescriptively, you can build to the total building performance option, or what is it? The total simulated building performance option.
Right.
Or is
We
it
keep
just the
changing the name.
simulated
Yep.
What are we all even calling it? We're always changing the name now every cycle. What was wrong with simulated performance compliance? But regardless, you could go with the cost compliance option. That's essentially what it is. You could go ERI, and you get into some of these other programs and it's a little bit more narrow. Basically you're just saying it's kind of like there isn't, for zero energy ready homes, there isn't a prescriptive path anymore. It's all ERI. And so, I would be, for someone who administers code in like a more rural area, do you have enough raters to have coverage? Did you get ERIs? Now, obviously, BER and ResNet, we would all love if every single house in America has to have HERS ratings on it. We would be fine with that. But, I don't know if I really want to advocate for a system that only has one path forward. I like the fact that, people who want to build prescriptive, they can just go that way and kind of, more or less they're told, what their, prefix more or less is. Prefix menu of, and with a couple of options for, sort of the side dishes that they can get. I like the fact that that exists. I think a lot of policymakers like the fact that that exists. So I don't know, Gayathri, do you have any concerns about that?
I think there's a lot of people pondering what's next, right? So like you said, if 2027 is not leading us forward, what are our other options? And, getting states to adopt the IECC or alternate versions. I know like folks are talking about ASHRAE 90.2, just like commercial codes adopt 90.1. That's just not my wheelhouse. I don't do a lot of work, helping states decide how to adopt. I know there's, every state is a little bit different, right? So they have legislation, like you were saying, Rich, that you have to adopt a latest one. You can't amend it this way. There's other states where you absolutely cannot adopt the appendix, right? So there's lots of limitations. I don't even know if I can opine on like what could possibly happen. I guess I'm holding out for optimism that the board of directors will see this second rinse and repeat of 2021, and I am hopeful that they will not do the same thing for a third time in a row, because I think as much as people would like to just give up and move on to something else, it's ingrained in society. It is the model code. It is in terms of urgency, right? I think I am terrified that we're not moving fast enough. So to start over and every state have to figure out something new and better to adopt,
That would be a disaster.
we don't have time for that. We just don't
Well,
have time. I'd rather fix the system that is out there that people know is a little broken, but there are clear fixes for it. It's abundantly clear that the board of directors could make very definitive changes to scope and intent, make it very crystal clear. We've decided we are just energy conservation. We will not do anything besides reducing site energy at this home. It doesn't include solar. It doesn't include electric readiness, demand response. None of that is part of this. As long as they're clear and they say it goes in this code or it goes in this code, and if you want more, there's an appendix. Just be clear about it. And then the states that can't adopt an appendix or whatever, then they would have other options. But I think it is really tough to start pivoting from something that has the most momentum, right? We are far behind in addressing climate change. We do not have time to get off this like rolling train and pick up something else and think we can get that off the ground and get to net zero by 2030. I mean, I guess I'm just not as confident that every state could do something like you're saying, Chris, and just be like, we've got FIAS out there, we've got zero energy. I know, like in Massachusetts, right? They point to FIAS all the time. Like so many passive house projects out of Massachusetts. It is awesome. Love it. I just don't know how many states can do that. And I think the point is well taken that not every state is even up to the 2018 or 15 code. So to get them to jump from whatever 2009 to zero energy, that's not happening, right? So I think somebody has mentioned this, like, you know, the silver lining in all of this is if the 2024 is enough to compel one of those states from skipping 2021 and going straight to 2024, that is actually progress. We have actually accomplished something. Even if it doesn't feel like that right now, because we thought we accomplished more, we can at least say that, like, if those states start adopting 2024, we actually did make progress. I'm going to hold on to that.
You know, so look, you know, there's a hint of optimism here, perhaps. Let's also maybe really quickly, let's talk about some of the good stuff. You know, when I looked at the draft version of the code, you know, some things that I saw that I thought were really great was a more straightforward ERI path of compliance. The ventilation calculations weren't all mucked up like they were in previous versions of the code, and I think it was a little bit more straightforward as to what you had to do. You know, so I liked that element of it. You know, there's a really nerdy thing that I really liked about it, about the draft, which was in the R405 reference home. It tells you exactly where the reference home ducts are located and what percentage. It looks a lot more like Energy Star. Was that you, Gayathri?
I might have had a hand in that, yes.
Yeah, I figured that was you. That's awesome because, you know, that's always been kind of these like the software has been basically forced to have to make a guess as to what the intent was. And this looks a lot more like how it is in Energy Star homes in terms of their reference design. And so I think it will just help us have a more consistent process of calculating what those expected savings are when it pertains to duct work. Any other big highlights for you, Gayathri?
So there, outside of the readiness things that are gone and demand response, I think we talked about R408, but I'm not sure how many of your listeners actually are in a state that's already adopted 2021 that even know what R408 is, right? So just real quick.
Additional efficiency packages. So
Yeah.
basically, no longer can you just look at the insulation tables and say, oh, I'm going to build it at this level of insulation. I'm good enough. Basically, R408 is an additional efficiency package on top of your selection of going prescriptive. So yeah, maybe let's talk a little bit about that.
Hey,
Yeah,
Chris.
so-
Chris, if you don't mind, let me do this. Let me share, if you mind, can I share my screen real quick? Because I think this will help you. Because I've got a document that we're going to end up utilizing here in the county that pretty much references 408 as it stands today in the 21 code. That is what's in the gold table here. And then in the red table is pretty much the R408 table that we're going to see in 24, because that was the Maryland amendment.
You might blow that up a little bit here.
Yeah, I'm gonna absolutely. And this is what we're working on to make sure that you know, when we get permit applications in, that, you know, our applicants are going to be filling out this document to tell us which pathway they're going. So I think, does that help you with the vision?
Better. Yeah, absolutely. So maybe just give us a quick summary about how it differs between 21 versus 24.
Great. So in 21, the R408 table, which is the one in gold here, is pretty much just 5 options. You've got to pick one. Depending upon your compliance path, you are narrowed into one of the options or more so. But in 24, we really went from 5 to almost, I believe, Gayathri, it was like almost 32. And I know we didn't pick everything in Maryland that wouldn't be applicable for climate zones 4 or 5. So we kind of took some of them out. But you're looking at putting all your ducks inside, getting points, or getting the additional option in high efficiency air conditioners or heating systems, getting points for that, reducing your total UA, and getting points. And we did it as a percentage because in Maryland we said in climate zone 4 and 5 you need to get 6% out of this table that's in red. 24 is going to look a little different in how it was finally developed, because we had to do this probably in our first year of consensus committee development. We were in the process of adopting 21 here in the state. So, I'm really charged with that we were able to do this at a local level, knowing what's coming in 24, bypassing some of the sins that I call in 21, and moving us into a glide path where we're going to be ready for 24 in maybe a year or two when the state starts to do their adoption. So gives us a lot more capabilities. We've thermal envelope has kind of exhausted our ability to see a significant savings that are cost effective. And this is where we're going to be going, just like you alluded to in the beginning of this cast. 2006, we saw the inkling of this. Then it went out of the code. Now we're heavily coming back into not only looking at efficiencies for equipment, but expanding those, looking at Energy Star appliances in homes and things like that. So, that's one of the things that we're trying to do here, and we're going to capture all this information as we are getting permits in for the 21 code and pushing this out to our inspectors in the field so they know what to be looking for. We also have the challenge of making sure that our trade permits, our mechanical permits that come in maybe 30 days after the building permit, this all has to align and has to get into the different hands of different staff members on my team that need to make sure that, hey, we selected a high efficiency air conditioner at 18 SEER. Well, that has to be actually installed and verified in the field. So
yeah, it goes back to potentially the role of third-party verification.
Absolutely.
And so, I'll say, what this kind of does is I'd say it expands upon what occurred with R408 within the 2021 cycle, but maybe gives a little bit more flexibility. It's not quite so rigid.
Right.
Basically people can, have individual items that they want to take out, perhaps of those additional options. But not necessarily, you have to just do it one way. So I like this. Another thing that I saw within chapter 1 was obligatory insulation inspection, which apparently wasn't there in the code before, which is kind of mind blowing to me that wasn't there before. So anybody want to discuss that?
So from my perspective, we were always requiring insulation inspections. We when we adopt the codes in the county, we were always going back to chapter 1 of the IBC, and then we kind of filter out chapter 1 of all the other codes. So we make chapter 1 our administrative chapter from IBC. Yeah. So there is an insulation inspection that's already there. It's required. We were always doing it. It's either we do it or a third party's doing it. And that's, I think, the difficulty moving forward with this is that we have to better define the role and what a third party and what a third party is. Obviously we're accepting an accredited ResNet individual. Whereas before we were pretty much looking at third parties as engineers or architects. That's not going to occur in the residential. So we've got to look at and rely on the third parties such as yourself and have a level of I want to phrase this the correct way, have a level of confidence, I think is a good word, that the information that we're getting from the third parties that we don't regulate are giving us the correct information. And we've had that conversation before, Chris, that, that's the next step to this and putting
Maybe
this
an
together.
opportunity for the 2027 then.
And Gayathri and I talked about it this morning. If I'm lucky enough to be on the 27 committee, that's going to be one of my things that I'm going to potentially look at. How does this all play together, and how do we?
It doesn't exactly sound glamorous, but you know what, Rich, I may throw my hat in the ring too, and decide to get involved perhaps, because that is definitely a component that I'm very passionate about. But I think that, honestly, we've been trying to make these casts a little bit more narrow in scope, but this was obviously a very important topic to discuss. And I'm glad that we got to have a couple of different perspectives on it. So thank you both for being willing to come and chat with us on the BERcast.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Glad to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll plan on seeing you all for the next episode. Won't be too long. And we'll talk to you next week.